What's up, friends? Today I'm gonna teach you how to make a plaster cast of an animal track, like this one. Basically, a track cast is something you can make when you find a track of an animal of any kind. All you have to do is create some kind of a border or wall around the track, pour plaster into it, allow it to harden, and then you can pull it out and you'll have a relief print. As you can see here, I have two plaster casts of the same animal, a mink, and they look completely different. So this is why I'm going to make a little tutorial for you on how to effectively do this. Okay. So why would you want the track cast? I like to have them just as art and decoration to hang around my house. I think they're super cool. They also make amazing gifts. I've given these to people who maybe have a particular affinity to an animal. Sometimes people will do this to remember a special pet. If you're a nature educator, these are amazing because you can actually pick them up and bring them with you and show them to your students. So this one here is one of my favorite track casts I've ever taken. This is actually a mountain lion. And as you can see by the little bit of substrate that's left here on the cast, this was taken in kind of a silty mud. I actually ran half a mile in the drizzling rain with a bundle of plaster to capture this. And this is a teaching tool that I use all the time to teach about what's called an indirect register walk, which is when an animal steps partially but not completely on its previous track. So when I hand this to students and I ask them how many toes they see, they're going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then there's kind of this pause as they try to think of an animal that has 6 toes and 2 heel pads. So what ingredients do you need? You're going to need a carton of plaster, which you can get at most hardware stores. I picked mine up at Canadian Tire for $10. You're going to need a container of some kind to pour the plaster and mix it in. You're going to need some water to mix in with the plaster, a stir stick to mix it all together with. And of course, you're going to need your track, and I will tell you how to pick out a good track. You're also going to need something to form the borders or walls around the track that will contain the plaster and keep it from running everywhere. There's 2 other ingredients you're going to need. One is time. These take time to dry. If it's hot outside, it can dry in half an hour. If it's rainy and moist, you might be waiting overnight or into the next day. And you're going to need weather to be on your side, because if the weather changes midway through your plaster curing, you can have some pretty big problems, which I will go into in detail. All right, so before you can start mixing your plaster, you need to choose a good track. You can't cast a track that is in dry sand or very fine dry substrate, because if you do, when you try to pour your plaster into it, it's going to destroy the track. It needs to be in ideally a damp or firm substrate. The substrate needs to be stiff enough and firm enough that it can withstand having something poured into it. The track needs to be on flattish ground. Otherwise, obviously when you pour your plaster, it's a liquid, it's going to all kind of pool to one side. So once you've found your perfect track, you're going to create some kind of a border around it that's going to contain the plaster and keep it from running all over the ground. And then you're going to build your little walls into the ground to contain the plaster. So you can do this by very delicately pinching the ground into shape, as I did with these, which is going to create kind of a natural ramp. I think I used stick borders on this one on 2 of the sides. I actually just placed sticks and I kind of made a square around it. Or you can use like a tag board or thin paper, and you can kind of stick it into the ground and make almost like a circular border. And let's see, I did that on this one here. And then I further refined it with a file when I got home. I kind of took off some of the edges. Gives you a nice clean edge. The main thing that you're going to want to be careful of as you build these walls is you don't want to disturb the track. So be careful not to drop things into the track. Try not to push on the ground in a way that's going to change the shape of the track, because ultimately that's going to give you something that's not accurate to life. The next step is to mix and pour your plaster into the track. This is probably the most stressful part of the process. So you're going to add some plaster into your container, And then you're going to start adding water, and you're going to add the water little by little and mixing it in. You're going to go for a consistency that's similar to a pancake batter. But I say that knowing that I like my pancakes thinner than most people. So you're not going for that like thick, fluffy, cake pancake. You're going for that nice, thin, kind of like somewhere between a crepe and a pancake. The reason I'm getting into specifics here is that you need your batter, so to say, to be thin enough that it can pour into the finest detailed areas of the track, but to be thick enough that it doesn't just soak like water into the sand or the substrate. So if you have a track with little claws in it, you really need to focus on, especially if you're doing multiple batches, that first batch of plaster has to be just the right consistency to sink into those claws. As you can see with my bear track here, I got a lot of the claw detail, but I lost a little bit of it here because my plaster was too thick to sink in there. So make sure you get the right consistency and feel free to practice before you go for it on your favorite track. The other thing you want to make sure is that you don't have any clumps in the mixture. And ideally, you can mix together all the plaster that you need before you pour it in, knowing that you're wanting your cast to be between like 1/2 inch and 1 inch thick, depending on how wide the actual cast is going to be. As you can see here, also, this cast broke in half and I glued it back together because I love it so much. But it's a great example of the fact that these can be a bit fragile, but you also want to make sure that they're thick enough. So if it's a smaller track, like this one here, I didn't pour it more than 1/2 inch thick, and that's going to be plenty sturdy for me. But with an enormous track, like this one here, it's almost 1 inch thick, definitely 1 inch thick in some places, and that's just to keep it firm enough that I don't have to worry about it being super fragile and snapping. Okay, so when you're pouring your plaster, you're going to hold the container really close to the ground so that it's as gentle as possible. You're going to start by pouring into those deepest, most detailed parts, and then you're going to kind of fill in the rest of the track. If you don't have enough plaster on the first pour, like I didn't on my bear track, you can make another subsequent batch and pour that on top. The problem here is that if you're not quick enough, it can cause the bottom layer to start to harden while the next layer is a lot more wet, and those can create weak areas that could split or fracture in the future. So you can also use a stick to kind of push the plaster around into areas if you're having trouble with that. Just be very careful not to disturb the track itself. If you're worried about the cast being too fragile, putting sticks into the back of it after you've poured all your plaster can help to stabilize it. And I'm very glad I did it on this track, and you will find out why. So when you go to collect your track, make sure that you don't leave a bunch of plaster bits lying around in the landscape. While it's not super harmful to the environment, this stuff isn't super toxic, I don't want to leave a foreign material out in the forest. This is just part of Leave No Trace. So what can go wrong? So many things can go wrong, and that is why this is like the process that seems really simple but can actually be quite complicated. So one of the biggest problems that I've had is weather. Either it's just not hot enough outside to dry my track in the time frame that I've left myself, or the weather completely changes and it's sunny and then it starts to pour. And as you can imagine, if your track is getting wet consistently, it's going to be very hard for the plaster to dry. Another common mistake that people will make is they're so excited to clean off their track that they'll do it before the plaster is fully dry. With both of these casts, I started kind of scrubbing the substrate away before the plaster was totally dry, and you can see that I totally lost the detail. So you really got to give these time to dry. So the next thing that can go wrong is water levels. Sometimes you find the perfect track, and the reason it's so good is because it is in damp sand or mud in an area that is prone to flooding. I'm going to tell you a little bit about gathering this track. I found this one along the Squamish River Valley, which is one of my favorite places to track. And this was part of a line of just massive, stunning, just perfect tracker's dream grizzly bear tracks. I had brought my plaster with me, hoping to find something cool like this, and I went about pouring it. Unfortunately, I had a very small container and it took a whole thing of plaster, like a whole carton, to do this one track. So I had to continually mix batch after batch and pour them in on top of each other, which was a little stressful. The other thing that happened, which was pretty bad, and I have no idea still how it's managed to survive, but the river level went up overnight as I was waiting for this to dry. And in the morning when I came down to the sandbank from the camping site, it was really clear that the water had gone up because in a spot where I had sort of just thrown a log over the river as a bridge to cross, the whole bridge was washed away and I had to go in up to my waist, carrying my gear above my head and wade through these sections of river just to get to the spot where I'd left my track. And when I got there, sure enough, it was under an inch of water. And it was this moment of like, oh no, are we gonna be able to save it? So I went over and I kind of poked it with a stick and I could see that it was actually about 70% cured. So I managed to kind of use sticks and my fingers to dig around it and pull it up and out of the ground and just carry it so delicately over to the dry sandbank. I let it sit for several hours before even starting to clean it off. And then, you know what? I brought it home and the next day I was kind of cleaning off the edges and it was still wet. So what I learned is the thicker you make this, the longer it's going to take to dry, and you really want to leave it some time. But it's also just a testament to the fact that, sometimes the products, the result of your efforts can be beautiful, even if you have some challenges along the way, right? So give it a try, and you'll probably come out with something fairly good. I now have, this beautiful kind of like pride of my nature museum grizzly bear plaster cast. Thanks for coming along for the journey, coming along for the ride, and I hope you learned something. And if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe below. You can also check out my Patreon for more videos on cool little bushcraft projects and nature-inspired art at patreon.com/minktracks.